with their green growth as well as climate action updates. Now, to expand the discussion into the business of conservation and also, very importantly, valuing Malaysia's rainforests. Joining me in the studio is Adam Farhan, co-founder and director with Rimba Watch. Adam, thanks so much for making the time to join us in the studio.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So, Adam, let's get the conversation going. And, of course, we just heard about MGTC and the corporate SME sector's efforts to try and green their businesses. Tell me why we also have to keep the focus on deforestation, especially given the fact that Malaysia has commitments now to becoming carbon neutral by 2050.
Yes, well, Malaysia has those climate commitments, and they also have a commitment to maintain 50%, forest cover. It's important for businesses to understand that forests are not, unproductive and empty spaces. They do provide a lot to Malaysia's economy, through ecosystem services. So that's, water, soil regulation, temperature regulation, carbon sequestration, and this is something that sometimes gets glossed over in the wider, sustainability discourse because forests are commonly, set to the side.
And they're almost seen as a separate entity, right? How do we sort of reconcile and change that perspective, Adam?
Yeah, well, you have to look at forests as a key, both a mitigator and an adapter of climate change.
Right.
Because as we reduce emissions, forests not only help us on the way to reducing emissions, but Malaysia is a very vulnerable country to climate change, and forests are extremely key to mitigating the worst impacts of climate change upon Malaysia.
Absolutely. So when we're looking at also something interesting which Rimba Watch has brought up last year, in fact, about environmental impact assessment or EIA reports by the Department of Environment, where you all had some things to say about monocropping, particularly with regards to rubber plantations. Now, why are these also risks for not just the environment, but also for business?
Yeah, well, okay, I think before I talk about that, I need to explain a bit about what, what we're referring to. Malaysia has a number of programs. So in Peninsular Malaysia, it's called Ladang Hutan. In Sarawak, it's called the License for Planted Forest. And in Sabah, it's called the Industrial Timber Plantation Program. These, despite having forest in their name, these are just monoculture timber plantations, which are established inside forest reserves. So, as a business, if you are involved in these activities, one is that, you are greatly reducing the biodiversity of Malaysia.
Absolutely. Monocropping, right? Mono meaning just one sort of hundreds of hectares, possibly.
Yes. So a natural forest in Malaysia supports hundreds of species per hectare.
Right.
And as you just said, a monoculture plantation would only have one. And beyond that, by replacing a natural forest with a monoculture plantation, you are completely removing, the majority of the carbon stocks of that forest. And therefore, in terms of climate reporting, this is something you're going to have to look into. But beyond that, just in terms of the business angle,
right.
Recent studies on timber plantation programs, particularly in Kelantan, have shown that it's not really a viable business model, because there's no workers to tend the plantations. The plantations are very, very exposed to the risk of weeding, and that reduces the yield of the timber.
Right.
And beyond that, there's many cases of timber plantations where the land is cleared. The natural forest is cleared, but the plantations is not actually established. Therefore, it's just an easier way, perhaps, to get a logging license.
I actually really appreciate you clearing the air a little bit about what could be surface projections for productivity and profits, especially for states that are a little bit more impoverished on the East Coast, might actually mean not just environmental degradation, but in fact, additional tacked on costs over the years, right?
Yeah, and beyond that, by being involved in programs that are called Ladang Hutan, Ladang Hutan, there is no
It's all about
hutan.
the semantics.
Yes. So you're exposing yourself to greenwashing, because civil society knows what's going on. They know that Ladang Hutan is just monoculture plantations in forest reserves. If you as a business are involved in Ladang Hutan and you are projecting yourself as a sustainable entity because you are, for example, restoring timber stocks,
right?
We do not agree with that. Civil society, we have our stance on deforestation, and if you're a business, then you will be very exposed to us calling you out for greenwashing.
So speaking of greenwashing, also Rimba recently launched a State of the Malaysian Rainforest 2023. Findings show we've deforested 349,244 hectares of land between 2017 to 2021,
yes.
equivalent to the same number of sports fields. So that is an incredible amount.
It's a lot of sports
if you really look at how many sports fields,
yes.
right? So what is the role of forest cover now, Adam, in relation to not just, of course, the recent widespread floods that we've been experiencing around Malaysia, but also anticipated El Nino weather cycle by July?
Yeah.
We're already feeling a little bit of it. And at the same time, are there any comparative best practices models regionally or even globally?
Okay, well, on precipitation, forests, for one thing, they reduce flood risk. Particularly the roots, they reduce the risk of landslides, and that reduces the risk of mud going into the rivers, and that reduces the risk of the rivers silting up, and therefore, causing floods. That's one thing, but, there's a bit of double materiality here. Forests also, in terms of drought, deforestation increases the risk of drought. So, for example, there was a very recent study that was just published a few days ago that modeled drought risk in areas experiencing high rates of deforestation. And so for the Congo, for deforestation in Congo, if that continues, they are estimating that by 2100, precipitation in Congo will decrease by 8 to 12%. And they also estimated that
staggering for a rainforest.
Yeah, and for every percentage loss of precipitation, crop yields will decrease by 0.5% as well. And so, if you adapt this to the Malaysian context, if we lose 12% of precipitation, we're going to lose 6% of our crop yields from, for example, palm oil. And that would be, a massive, massive impact to our economy.
Absolutely, such a huge blow. Thanks for framing that. And Adam, moving now into Rimba study also showing that Sarawak, Pahang have experienced the highest rates of deforestation. Let's look at Tasik Chini in Pahang, for example, and the way in which the Tasik Chini Biosphere Reserve, or the TCBR, it now actually risks losing that UNESCO awarded status.
Yeah, well, the thing about this Tasik Chini issue is that the deforestation occurring around Tasik Chini, as with the vast majority of deforestation across Malaysia, is perfectly legal, because Malaysia's laws it's in itself are a low benchmark if you're talking about deforestation. So that's happening in Tasik Chini, and Tasik Chini is an interesting case because it has international recognition.
Correct.
But if you just look at forests all around Malaysia, there is a certain discourse in Malaysia where people blame illegal logging for deforestation. But what we're seeing is that all the deforestation that I analyze in my report, it's legal, because all they have to do is submit the applications to log, and then submit the environmental impact assessments. And the Department of Environment, the EIA guidelines, they're not against deforestation. You just have to mitigate it to the level of acceptable impact as defined in the guidelines. And those, that threshold's very low. It's stuff like making sure there's no illegal hunting going on in the area.
That's right.
So I think the point I'm making is that if you as a business, you have to go beyond regulatory compliance. Your ESG policies have to be way, way beyond Malaysian regulation, and it has to be aligned with the needs and expectations of civil society.
Absolutely. And now just casting that same spotlight briefly on Sarawak as well, and their critical need for not just biodiversity regulation, but at the same time meeting the socio-economic demands and expectations of the local population.
Yeah, well, okay, no, Sarawak's an interesting case because a lot of inner Sarawak is settled by indigenous peoples.
Absolutely.
And so they, in reference to international law, Malaysia has ratified the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so if you look at that, these indigenous peoples in Sarawak have rights to their native customary lands. And these native customary lands are, massive. For example, if you look at the Penan community, their customary land spans, maybe 150 to 200,000 hectares. And so, whatever economic development happens in forests in Sarawak, it has to be with the free, prior, and informed consent of local communities. And that the community's perception and acceptance of deforestation will vary by community. But if you look at a lot of Penan communities, they are, extremely against not just forest conversion, but just selective logging happening within their areas. And so this is something businesses also have to look at. Forests are not empty spaces economically, but they're not empty spaces socially either.
Absolutely.
People live there. It is inscribed in the cultural identities of a lot of people. And therefore, if you're going to pursue any activities within that area, you need to, get the consent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam. I think this is such an interesting conversation that also needs to be continued. And in the meanwhile, of course, that has been Adam Farhan, who is the founder and director of Rimba Watch.